All right, I will say good morning. Good morning. Let us begin by thanking all of our sponsors for today's shiur. To thank our TALMUD TORAH sponsors for the month of Cheshvan. To thank Steve Teri Czinn for dedicating all the shiur and drushos this month in loving memory of Steve's father, Bunim Tzvi ben Chaim, on the occasion of his 18th Yahrzeit. Leah Sol as a zechus for refuah sheleimah for her daughter Ilana bas Esther, and for all of those wounded in Eretz Yisroel, and the zechus of all of our soldiers. Yonason Rachel Wolff for a complete and lasting refuel Yitzchak for Refuel Yitzchak Baruch ben Esther, Cherry and Sora Wolasky, and the zechus for refuel for their grandson Zecharya Dov ben Perel Shira, and Azriel and Iris Miller in the zechus of our holy soldiers of the IDF, and in the merit of our brothers and sisters in Eretz Yisroel. We thank our Week of Learning sponsors, Robert Emas, in honor of the Yahrzeit of his mother, Rus Bas Sora, and an appreciation for the entire Daf Yomi shiur. Incredible. We thank all of our sponsors for their generosity and for the beauty of their sponsorships. We hope that in the merit of our TALMUD TORAH, all of the Neshama, Slav, and Aliyah, the families in Nechama, and all those who need a refuah should have one together with Kol Cholei Yisrael. And we, of course, echo the sentiment that in Eretz Hashem, our learning should be a zechus for our holy soldiers, that they should be successful in all of their missions, and in Eretz Hashem Baruch Hu should give our brothers and sisters in Eretz Yisroel the staying power, the hope, the confidence, and the strength to be able to weather the coming days. We'll say with that, let us begin. So we are picking up in Eretz Hashem. Today's daf is Samech Zayin 67, and we are picking up in Eretz Hashem on 66b Samech Vav Amaduyis. We have a lot to do today. So we are picking up in Eretz Hashem. Hischel Rabbi Akiva, right? I think that makes sense. Hischel Rabbi Akiva. It's like point in the middle of the page. So we'll say, so remember again, just to reorient ourselves very quickly. So we had a machlokes Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Tarfon about what happens if you find a mikvah that is deficient. So obviously I understand from this point going forward, anything that the mikvah is unusable. And obviously anything immersed in the mikvah will still retain its tummy identity. What's the shayla? The shayla is, what about anything that has been immersed in that mikvah? In other words, let's say, here's what I know in that case. I know there was a point that the mikvah was kosher, and now I know the mikvah is not kosher. So in between the last point that I know that the mikvah is kosher and now, what is the status of anything immersed inside of that mikvah? That's our fundamental shayla. So Rabbi Tarfon says tar. Everything immersed there up until the point now ultimately is tar, and Rabbi Akiva ultimately says that it's tamei. So again, the machlokes Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Tarfon turned out to be a machlokes. So what do you compare mikvah to? Do you compare mikvah to a kohen who's found out to be a baal mum, in which case, again, all of his avodah is retroactively void? Or do you compare it to a case of a kohen who's found out to be a ben grusha ben chalutza, in which case, again, his past avodah is fine, but going forward, ultimately is not? Because Hischel Rabbi Akiva ladun, mikvah pisula biyachid, a baal mum pisula biyachid. So Rabbi Akiva says a mikvah is status. Its status could be ascertained through the testimony of an individual, and ultimately, again, if a kohen is a baal mum, that could also be ascertained through the testimony of an individual. But you can't compare mikvah to testifying about a kohen who's a ben grusha ben chalutza, because that requires two witnesses. Now, I will say, the Gemara has not explained why does testifying about a kohen that he's a baal mum, why does it only require one witness? We're going to come back to that. TORAH, the other possibility is mikvah psula b'gufo, baal mum psula b'gufo. The other possibility I will say is that ultimately mikvah, the psul that we're talking about, there's an inherent psul in the actual mikvah itself. Similarly, baal mum psula b'gufo. When a kohen is discovered to be a baal mum, that's also a psul, that's also a disqualification inherent in the kohen himself. And therefore, again, don't compare it to a ben grusha ben chalutza, where ultimately, again, the psul of a ben grusha ben chalutza is not in the kohen. I mean, it is in the kohen, but it's not caused from him, it's caused from something external to him. So I will say, after Rabbi Akiva says this is so beautiful. Amarli Rabbi Tarfon, Akiva. Rabbi Tarfon says, Rabbi Akiva, Kala porish mimcha ki porish min hachayim. It's such a beautiful statement. So Rabbi Tarfon agrees. He ultimately agrees with Rabbi Akiva, or at least in concept agrees with Rabbi Akiva, and he gives us this incredible praise. Akiva, whoever separates from you, separates from life. And I will say, he could have just said, You're right. Right? Or shkoyach, right? What do you mean? Whoever separates you, separates. I'm going to say, so we understand the profundity of this statement. I'm going to say this goes back to the daf that we had on the day of Shmini Atzeres, right? When we quoted Rabbi Akiva. I'm going to say, so remember again, who is Rabbi Akiva? Rabbi Akiva, at the end of the day, is the sole, not the sole personality, but the dominant personality who teaches us how to have confidence and how to have hope and how to have optimism even in the darkest of times. Rabbi Akiva is one who's, while he's being brutally executed by the Romans, finds a way to teach those around him how to go ahead and experience an aliyah even in the most overwhelming times of Yerida. Rabbi Akiva teaches us how to find Kiddusha in the midst of Tumah. He teaches us how to find light in the midst of darkness. Rabbi Akiva is the one who represents, at the end of the day, the fundamental staying power of Klal Yisrael. That's Rabbi Akiva. Always referencing back to the Gemara Maseches Makos, end of Makos, right, where all the Rabbanim are walking through the ruins of the Beis Hamikdash, and all they see is ruin and desolation. And what does Rabbi Akiva say? Rabbi Akiva sees hope. Rabbi Akiva sees the future. Rabbi Akiva sees building. So we'll say that line is so true and resonates especially with such incredible importance for us contemporarily. If you separate yourself from the hashkafa of Rabbi Akiva, kiparish min hachayim, then I will say you lose yourself in the abyss of darkness. There's so much overwhelming sadness, and there's so much overwhelming tragedy, and there's so much overwhelming loss. But if you hold on to Rabbi Akiva, ultimately you'll be filled with hope, with optimism, with a vision of light for the future. You go ahead and divorce yourself from Rabbi Akiva, ultimately again a person could so easily give up on life. So profound. So the Gemara says, Hi Baal Mum Shebsul Yachid Echidami. So let's go back for just a second. Right? Rabbi Akiva mentioned that a Baal Mum, his status could be established ultimately again through an Eid Echad. What's that case? Hechidami, what's that case? Either kamachishle, if ultimately again, so in other words, the Eid Echad says you're Baal Mum, and the Kohen says no, I'm not. So mi mehem, would the Eid Echad be believed in that case? Ella the shasik. Rather than both saying must be what's the case. Remember, this is our primary topic, by the way. Remember again, how do we get into all of this? All of this is because we're dealing with a case of what happens if Reuven and Rachel say that they're married, and that claim is backed up by an Eid Echad. So does that mean anything? Does that mean anything? Then we went from there about what happens if an Eid Echad says something and the person about whom he's testifying is silent. Right? Does the silence mean acquiescence? And does acquiescence ultimately again give power to the Eid Echad? So this is all. So what's the case of the Eid Echad by the Baal Mum? So the Gemara says, if at the end of the day, rather it must be, the Eid Echad is saying to the Kohen, you're a Baal Mum, and the Kohen is silent. With the Kavasik Ben Grusha Ben Chalutza. The Shasik, I will say the parallel case would be by Ben Grusha Ben Chalutza. An Eid Echad shows up, says to a Kohen, you're a Ben Grusha Ben Chalutza, and the Kohen is silent. The Katani, Mikvah Psula B'Yachid, or Balmum Psula B'Yachid. So ultimately, what did the Brisa say? The Brisa said, or the Mishnah said, that Mikvah, status of the Mikvah, could be established through an Eid Echad, just like the status of a Kohen Baal Mum could be established through an Eid Echad. But ultimately, again, do not bring a right ben grusha ben chalutza. That has to be established through two people. Now, Rabbi said, interestingly enough, so what do you see from here? The fact that a ben grusha ben chalutza, that status could only be established through two witnesses, indicates to us what? That ein davar shebe erva pachos mishnayim. That whenever you have a matter concerning erva, which is both say, remember again, if you testify that a Kohen is a ben grusha ben chalutza, what does that mean? You're testifying that his parents' marriage is illegal. That's a davar sheba erva, and a davar sheba erva by definition is going to require two witnesses. Va'abayim says the olam to kamachishle. No. The case is where when the Kohen goes out and says, when the witness says to the Kohen, you're a Baal Mum, the Kohen is contradicting him. So you'll say, 1 second. If a guy's showing up and says, hey Kohen, you're a Baal Mum, and Kohen says, no, I'm not. So why would we believe the Baal Mum? Why would we believe the Eid Echad in that case? It's very simple. The Amrle Shalach Achvi. So we'll say this is very simple. So what could the Eid Echad say? Take off your clothes. In other words, I'm claiming you're a Baal Mum. You're claiming you're not a Baal Mum. Let's say this is not something esoteric, right? This is something easily discernible. So ultimately, again, if the Kohen either refuses to do so, right, that would seem to indicate that there's legitimacy ultimately to the testimony of the Eid Echad. This is why we said before, the similarity between the mikvah and the Kohen Balmum is the mikvah, the psul is inherent in the mikvah itself, and Balmum, the psul is inherent in the Kohen himself. Fine. So the Gemara said ben grusha. So we'll say fine. So that's the end of that first section. So we'll see again. We will see that. Well, we'll get to that halacha just a little bit. Ben grusha ben chalutza davadoso ksherim minal. Now, what are the interesting distinctions that the Gemara made was as follows? Here was the interesting distinction. If a Kohen is found out to be a balmum, any avoda he has done is retroactively void, which is pretty significant. If a Kohen is found out to be a ben grusha ben chalutza, anything he's done in the past is fine, it's kosher, but from this point forward, obviously he can't do the avoda. So now we're going to try to figure out where does that distinction come from. So it's actually quite interesting. So the Gemara says as follows: Ben grusha ben chalutza avodaso ksherim minal. How do you know that when a Kohen is found out to be a ben grusha ben chalutza, that retroactively his avoda is kosher? So the Gemara says, Minal, Rabbi Shmuel Silber. The pasuk says, talking about the kahuna, that the kahuna will belong to Aaron and his offspring. V'haisalo be to him, ulazar o acharav, and his offspring after him. Bein zera kasher or bein zera pasal. Fascinating drasha. The Rebbe say the Torah itself makes an allowance for the offspring of Aaron, both offspring that's kasher as well as offspring that's pasal. So in other words, obviously, I will say, just to be clear, once the Kohen finds out that he's a ben grusha ben chalutza, what is he allowed to do? What is he allowed to do? Nothing, right? In other words, he's a chalal. He's a chalal. So as a chalal, he's not considered to be a Kohen. But the point over here is, the pasuk itself is making an allowance for a more expanded definition of offspring of Aaron, at least retroactively. Avod Shmuel or Mehacha. So the father of Shmuel said from the following verse: Baruch Hashem Chelo upoel Yadav Tirtze. So literally again, Hashem should bless his grandeur or his strength. Upoel Yadav Tirtze. The actions of his hands ultimately will be accepted. So it says Afilu Chulin Shebo Tirtze. Even if sometimes it turns out that what the Kohen did ultimately again is halacha l'maisa chulin, it's still accepted as avoda. Rabbi Yana Aramehacha ubasal hakohen shebe yamim haim. You will come to the Kohen who is in those days. The chisala adaitcha shadam holech esal kohen shlal yabiyamav. So why does the Torah have to say you'll go to the Kohen who's living in your time? Who else are you going to? Who else are you going to? Ela zek kasher ben ischala. Rather, what that's referring to is a Kohen who was kasher and then found out to be a chala. So we'll say, so three different sources, but all agreeing to the basic precept that if you have a Kohen who's found out to be a ben grusha ben chalutza, any avoda he has done retroactively is valid. Obviously, mikan l'abba, from this point forward, the avoda will be invalid. So that's the Kohen ben grusha ben chalutza. Bal mum davadosa psulinal. And how do I know that if a Kohen is found out to be a bal mum, right? He's found out to be a bal mum. Then how do I know that halacha l'maisa his avoda is pasul? Right. So remember again. So now as a Kohen who's discovered to have a blemish. So now what we're saying is obviously he can't function as a Kohen going forward. But not only that, retroactively anything he's done is void as well. So Rabbi Yehuda Amar Shmuel Damakra Lachin Emor Hineni No Silo Es Brisi Shalom. We'll say Parshas Pinchas. Therefore, again, when Pinchas becomes a Kohen, what does Hakadosh Baruch Hu say? I'm giving him Brisi Shalom. Now we translate Brisi Shalom as covenant of peace. Kishu Shalem below Kishu Chaser. So a little bit of a play on words. When does the Kohen get the covenant of the Kahuna? Brisi Shalem. We're vocalizing it as Shalem. Only when he's whole, i.e. not blemished, unblemished, and not when he's blemished. I v'hash shalom ksiv. It's only one problem. It's a great drasha, but that's not what it says. Right? It doesn't say shalom, it says shalom. So what do you do with that? Amrav Nachman, vav the shalom kitiyahi. The vav in shalom is a shorter vav. It's written with a shorter vav. So the fact that it's written with a shorter vav indicates to us what? That halacha l'maaseh can be vocalized as shalom. Incredible. So we'll say, let's catch up on a little bit of halacha l'maaseh, because there's a lot of great halacha over here. First of all, what about the mikveh case? Let's go back to the mikveh case, right? Because this is a big one. Right? We build a mikveh, We're building a mikvah. Yes, right? You build a mikvah, you go ahead and you measure it. And it's perfectly fine, right? Then a month later, you measure it again, it's deficient. So obviously, again, there's a whole bunch of stuff that happened in that mikvah over the course of the month. What's the status? So the Rambam in Hilchos Mikvos, Perek Yud Halacha Vav, says as follows. Listen to this. I want to skip a little bit. Good. He says, Kalataros shenasu al gabav l'mafreya temeos ad shivades man shenimdad bavahaya shalim. So both say we paskin like Rabbi Akiva. So the halacha is that if you have a mikvah that's found deficient, anything that you've done in the mikvah, up until retroactively to the last point you know the mikvah is kosher, ultimately are back to their tamei chazaka. So in other words, let me illustrate this. If you measure the mikvah on Rosh Chodesh Cheshvan, 40 sa'ah, right? You measure it again on the 15th of Cheshvan, and it's 39 sa'ah. Anything done in those last 2 weeks reverts back to its tamei status, right? In other words, essentially, the mikvah is only kosher up until the last point you know that it is definitively kosher. So it's a pretty dramatic halacha. We pass like Rabbi Akiva. Now it happens to be that different forms of tumah may be dealt with different ways, but at least that's the general principle. I will say, what about kohanim? I'm working backwards. So listen to this. Any kohen. So I will say. So now remember again, the Gemara made a distinction between a kohen bal mum and a kohen ben grusha ben chalutza. Listen to how the Rambam paskins. The Rambam says that halacha l'maisa, a kohen who's a bal mum is not permitted to go ahead and function as a kohen, which means he can't enter into the area of a Beis Hamikdash where normally again kohanim are permitted to enter. Now listen to this. He says v'im avad. Good. V'im avar v'nichnas loka apishla avad v'im av mikdash pasal v'chila avoda v'loka afala avoda. Ultimately, again, so I'll say halacha l'maisa. So the Rambam paskins that anything a kohen bal mum did is void retroactively as well as, of course, going forward. What about a kohen who's found out to be a ben grusha ben chalutza? So the Rambam writes in Bias Mikdash Vav Yud. Rambam writes kohen sha'avar v'nivdak v'nimtza chalal avodasu kshera l'sha'avar ve'inove labi. Fascinating, right? So same distinction of the Gemara over here. It's distinction of Rabbi Akiva. We pass like Rabbi Akiva in all of these cases. So a kohen who's found out to be a bal mum, anything he's done is retroactively void. A kohen who's found out to be a ben grusha ben chalutza, anything retroactively is fine, is kosher, but from this point forward, he cannot function as a kohen. I will say, why the distinction? It's exactly as you saw before. Kohen is a bal mum, psula b'gufo. There's an inherent invalidation, right? The kohen is a ben grusha ben chalutza. It's a status invalidation, and really, it's not from him. He, as a person, is absolutely physically fit, so to speak, for this position. It's the fact that his parents did something that ultimately conveys upon him a status. So halacha l'maisa ben grusha ben chalutza retroactively is good. Ultimately, again, going forward is not going to be good. I will say, last case. How did this all start? Reuven and Rachel get married, or Reuven and Rachel claim that they are married. They have an eid echad that goes ahead and supports them. What's the halacha? So the Rambam says in Hilchos Hishos Parak Tal halacha Zayim hamakadish be'eid echad ein choshishin lekidushav v'af api sheshnei modim. So we pass the halacha l'maisa. If you want to solidify your status as a married person, you need two witnesses. The fact that Reuven and Rachel both admit, quote unquote, admit that they are married to each other, and that admission is backed up by an eid echad, that does not go ahead and help. Halacha l'maisa, that is not going to go ahead and create a legal reality. Incredible. So I will say that is all of the halacha l'maisa from this previous sugya. Let us go weiter. Mishnah. Very interesting Mishnah here. Komakum shish kiddushin ve'ein avera. So we'll say, so now we're going to talk about different types of marriages. Any time that there's kiddushin ve'ein avera. So we'll say, what does that mean? Right? A marriage with no avera. You know what we call that? Marriage. In other words, that's just like, I know, it's like crazy, like it's like a regular case. Kiddushin and no avera. In other words, a permitted union. Like, so boring. I didn't wake up for this. I didn't go for permitted unions. Right? So what happens? So again, see, you just have a regular permitted union. What's the halacha? Ve'in avera havlad holich achar hazachar. So we'll say status is determined by the father. So what's an example of this? Ve'ezazu. So I'll say, what's the example of this? Zu, Kohenes, Leviah, V'Yisraelis, Shnasa Lekoin, Levi, V'Yisrael. So we'll say this is a typical case of marriage, right? So Reuven marries Rachel. The status, so to speak, of the child is determined by the father. So if Reuven's a Kohen, the kid is a Kohen. Reuven's a Levi, the kid is a Levi. Reuven's a Yisrael, the kid is a Yisrael. That's it. Even if mom, right, even if Rachel is a Kohenes, a Leviah, her status, so to speak, does not get conveyed down to the child. So any case where it is a permitted union, status of the child determined by the father. Next, what happens if you have a marriage and there is an avera? In other words, it is a prohibited union, then what's the halacha? So we'll say in that case, status is determined ultimately, again, by the parent with the blemished status. So what's the example of this? A widow marries a kohen gadol. A divorcee marries a regular kohen. Mamzer unesina li Yisrael. A mamzer or a nasin, right? A woman who's a mamzer marries a Yisrael, or bas Yisrael a nasin ula mamzer. So Rabbi say, in cases of prohibited unions, essentially, we'll call it the blemished status gets passed down to the child. So, for example, Reuven marries Rachel, and Reuven is a mamzer. So, therefore, again, their child is a mamzer. And by the way, it would be the same thing if Reuven married Rachel, and Rachel was the mamzer, or the mamzeres. Then what? The child's a mamzer. So, whenever you have a forbidden union, the damaged or blemished status, so to speak, gets passed down to the child. Next, the chomi she'en alav kiddushin. Aval yesh la'alachirim kiddushin havlad mamzer. Now we'll say any union where there is no kiddushin, but the parties involved could have kiddushin with someone else. Ultimately, again, the offspring is a mamzer. So the Gemara says, what is this example? So we'll say this is any case of arayos. So, for example, a man commits adultery with a woman, right? So ultimately, again, remember, Kiddushin is not possible in that case, right? Why is Kiddushin not possible in that case? She's married to someone else, right? A man has relations with his sister. A man has relations with his aunt, right? A man, in other words, we'll say, so in any case, his father's wife, who's not his mother, any case that is an arayos, where even if you try to marry this woman, there is no kiddushin, the offspring of that union is a mamzer. So the Gemara says, "V'chol mi she'ein lo alav v'lo alachim kiddushin havlad kimosa." That will say, in any case where you have a woman who can't have kiddushin at all, in other words, she can't marry anyone, then ultimately, again, the status of the offspring is like the mother. What's that case? So we'll say this would refer to a Jewish man who has a child with a non-Jewish woman. So this would be a case, again, he's framing it as Vlad Shifcha, the offspring of a Shifcha Kinanis, a non-Jewish maidservant, or Nachras, or non-Jewish woman. So we'll say, so a Shifcha, or ultimately, again, or a non-Jewish woman, they can't have Kiddushin with anyone. Right? Why? They're not Jewish. In other words, you can't have Kiddushin if you're not Jewish. So ultimately, again, so in that case, status of the offspring goes totally by the mother. Right? So we'll say, so really fascinating categories over here. So let's analyze each of them. Says the Gemara, Kol makom sheish Kiddushin. So remember again, first case, any situation where there is Kiddushin and there's no Avera. So then what's the halacha? We'll say, who determines the status of the child? Father. And I will say, I just want to point out, that's just regular, right? Baruch Hashem, that's us, right? That's just regular case of marriage. The status of the child is a Kohen, Levi, Yisrael, determined by the father. So the Gemara says, I'm going to Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Yochanan. Klalahu, dechol makom sheish kiddushin ve'en avera havlad holit achar hazachar. Is that true? Is that true that any case where ultimately, again, it's a permitted marriage, right? So yesh kiddushin, there is kiddushin, there's no avera, that the status of the child is determined ultimately by the father. What about Hare Ger? We'll say, let's go, top of Samazayim, top of 67. Hare Ger, Shenasa Mamzeres. What about the case of a Ger, convert, who marries a Mamzeres? Now we'll say, Diyesh Kiddushin, ultimately again, the marriage works. Ve'in avera. That is not a prohibition. A ger is permitted to marry a mamzeres. And yet, what's the halacha? Havlad holich achar apogum. We'll say, what's the status, ultimately, again, of the offspring? The offspring is a mamzer. The sanya ger shnas mamzeres havlad mamzer. The Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yossi holds that when a ger marries a mamzeres, ultimately, again, the offspring is a mamzer. Shabbos say, so here's a case. So again, this case goes against the principle of our Mishnah. Our Mishnah said that whenever you have a permitted marriage, no avera, status is determined by father. Yet, here Rabbi Yossi is saying that if you have a male convert, Reuven converted, right, marries Rachel, who's a mamzeres, permitted union, and yet we're saying the offspring is a mamzer, which means status is being determined by mother, not by father. So what's going on over here? Amrulei misarvis b'azisin Rabbi Yossi. Okay, that's Rabbi Yossi. Our Mishnah does not reflect the view of Rabbi Yossi. Whose opinion does our Mishnah reflect? Masnisin Rabbi Yehudi hi da'amer ger lo yisa mamzeres. Okay, interesting, I will say. So you're right, the Gemara says it's a good kasha. It's a good kasha. Our Mishnah doesn't reflect that view. Our Mishnah reflects the view of Rabbi Yehuda, and Rabbi Yehuda holds that a ger should not marry a mamzeres. Okay, so that's again, so difference of here. I will say, always so profound that sometimes what looks like a contradiction and what looks like a problem is actually not a problem, it's just a difference of opinion. And if you accept the fact that in life there are different opinions, you can reconcile almost anything. So ultimately, there's Rabbi Yossi and there's Rabbi Yehuda. Our Mishnah reflects the view of Rabbi Yehuda that a ger should not marry a mamzeres. Rabbi Yossi says a ger can marry a mamzeres, but there's a but, and the but is the offspring is going to be a mamzer. So next category, right? There's a case of where there is Kiddushin, but there is an avera. So remember again. So let's say you have a case where marriage is possible, but it's prohibited. For example, a Kohen marries a grusha, marries a divorcee. Kohen Gadol marries an almana. A Yisrael marries a mamzeres. So in all of these cases, what's the halacha? What's the halacha? Havlad achar hapagum. Ultimately, remember the offspring's status is determined by, quote unquote, the blemished parent, the genealogically blemished parent, or not the genealogically, because it's not a genealogical blemish, but ultimately again goes after the blemished parent. I'm going to use that lashon of blemished. So the Gemara says, so why not include this case? Why not include ultimately again the case of Gershnas Mamzeres? So the Gemara says, Tana kol makom the sefer lasuye. Inach will say when it says kol makom. Remember, the Mishnah doesn't mean to include. Look at Rashi just a moment. Rashi says, "V'nisnei kabi kiddushin v'yeshaver masnisim b'diamona." So remember, the Mishnah is not going to list every single case. Rather, the Gemara says, "Tana kol makom d'seifa lasuye." When it says kol makom ultimately means all cases. The Mishnah just means to give examples, but doesn't mean to provide an exhaustive list. V'bai say that possibility is the Olam Rabbi Yossi. Maybe it does really reflect the view of Rabbi Yossi. The Tana Eizazu Lemeute. And ultimately, again, the Tana includes Eizazu to exclude certain cases. The Eizazu Vesulo. So we'll say ultimately, again, is it coming to exclude just certain cases? Is that an exhaustive list? V'hari Chalal Shenasa Bas Yisrael. We'll say, what about the case of a Chalal who marries a Bas Yisrael? So remember again, Chalal we'll say is the offspring of a prohibited Kohanic union. So let's say a Kohen marries a Grusha, that child is a Chalal. So what about a Chalal who marries a regular Jewish girl? So what's the halacha? Yesh Kiddushin ve'in avera. So the halacha is, remember again, that's a case. There is Kiddushin, marriage works, there's no avera, and yet what's the halacha? Havlad holich achar hazachar. The offspring follows the male. So the Gemara says, "Halo kasha ki Rabbi Dostoi, Bren Yehuda." That follows Rabbi Yehuda. So I said that's not a kasha. Why? Because there is the position of Rabbi Dostoi and Rabbi Yehuda. Sirle. So the Gemara says, "V'hari." We're going to see that opinion in just a moment. V'hare Yisrael shenasa chalala. What about the case of a Yisrael who marries a chalala? Right. So again, same case, just opposite roles. The yesh kiddushin ve'in avera. Once again. So also, all the Gemara is just pointing out to us say is that halacha l'maisa. There are more cases. So we're going to give the same answer all the time. Either halacha l'maisa is reflective of a view not included in our Mishnah, or the statements of the Mishnah by definition are meant to include more cases than are listed here. It's not an all-encompassing list. So what about the case of Yisrael who married a chalala? Yesh kiddushin ve'in avera. That's the case ultimately again where there is kiddushin and there's no avera, and yet havlad halach achar hazachar. The offspring follows the zachar. To which the Gemara says once again, Tana kol makom d'reisha la'asuyeh. Again, you're right. That case should be included. We didn't list every single case, but that's what the phrase kol makom. Kol makom also means we're establishing a principle. We're giving some examples of the principle, but we do not mean to give the impression that the list we are creating is an all-encompassing list. So the Gemara says, "V'nisnei behedja," but why not mention it explicitly? To which the Gemara says, "Mishum d'lo masni lo." So the Gemara says, because it's not really a good way to list it. How so? Hechi nisni. What should we say? Kohenes Leviah v'Yisraelis v'chalala shenisleis lekohen Levi v'Yisrael. So the Gemara says, v'Yisrael. Should we write it as a Kohenes, a Leviah, a Yisraelis, right? Or a Chalala, who marries a Kohen Levi Yisrael. You can't do that. Why? Because Chalala, the Kohen Michazia, Chalala is not permitted to marry a Kohen. What about the case of Rabbi Barachana? The Amrinon Rabbi Barachana, Amr Rabbi Yochanan, Mitzri Sheni, Shenasa Mitzris Rishona. So let's listen to this. And remember, the halacha is by Mitzri, an Egyptian convert. The halacha is third generation, they are permitted to marry into the general marriage pool. So what happens if a second generation Mitzri marries a first generation Mitzris? What's the halacha? Bina Shlishi. Ultimately, again, their offspring is considered to be a third generation Mitzri. So the Gemara says, Bina Shlishi Hava, Tana Kol Makom Dereisha La'asuye. So we'll say, now, already all the Gemara just pointing out over here is, this should be another example which illustrates the first case in the Mishnah, yet it's not written. So the Gemara says, don't worry, Kol Makom Dereisha La'asuye. Again, I will say, we keep on going to do the same thing. Just listen to what's happening in the Gemara over here. The Gemara keeps giving additional examples which seem to illustrate the principles outlined in the Mishnah. And the Gemara is just asking, why didn't you include these? So I will say, either because some of them are reflective of views not included in the Mishnah, but more often than not, what the Gemara is saying is, you're right, we didn't create an all-exhaustive list. That's why the Mishnah began each category by saying what? Kol makom. Kol makom means what? In any situation, which by definition means, although the Mishnah is giving some examples, it's not giving all of the examples. So I will say, for example, over here, here's an example. A Mitzri Sheni marries a Mitzris Rishona. Their child is a Mitzri Shlishi. So what does that show? You're going after the father, right? Because again, remember, the father doesn't produce a Mitzri Sheni. That doesn't make sense because he's a Mitzri Sheni. But it's going after the father. So why not include this in the first category of the Mishnah? You're right. Kol makom dereisha la'asuye. When it says kol makom, it comes to include additional cases. Or Rav Dimi da'amar Sheni, Habi. According to Rav Dimi, who says that the child goes after the mother, and therefore the child is only a Sheni. Tana ezo zu l'me'ute. The ezo zu will come to exclude this case. Okay? Listen to this. Let's say when it comes ultimately again to the umos. So when the nations of the world have children, status is determined by the father. But if they convert, ultimately the identity of the child is dictated or goes after the more compromised of the two parents. Ultimately, fine. So halacha l'maisa, Ezazu will come to exclude this case. So what's this case? If you ultimately say that our Mishnah is Rabbi Yehuda, so ultimately again the kol makom, the inclusive phrase of the Reisha will come to include a Yisrael who married a chalala. That ultimately again status of the child will go after the father. And according to Rabbi Barachana, the ezazu of the Reisha will come to exclude the case of Rav Dimi v'Rabin. Amud Beis, kol makom de seifa la'asuye. The kol makom of the seifa comes to include ger shenasa mamzeres. Fine. Ella, and I will say the seifa is talking about a case of yesh kiddushin, the yesh avera. So that ultimately, I will talk about the case of a ger who marries mamzeres. Because we also remember again, that would be reflective of the view of Rabbi Yehuda, who says that a ger is not allowed to marry mamzeres. But if he says Rabbi Yossi, kol makom dereisha kida amron, then ultimately again the kol makom of dereisha, as we said before, Eizazuki da Amron. So what does the kol makom of the seifa case of yesh kiddushin and yesh avera? What does that come to include? So the Gemara says, "Ulatamech Rabbi Huda eizazu the seifa lamali." Why don't you need the eizazu of the seifa? Ela aidi de tana reisha eizazu tana seifa eizazu. I will say rather it could be that sometimes some of these eizazus, which are meant to exclude certain cases, ultimately again are just added in for mishnaic symmetry. Hakanami, I did the Tana Reisha Kamakom, Tananami Seifa Kamakom. Good. So we'll say, so bottom line. Okay, so let's kind of regroup over here. So remember again, we have our categories. What are our categories? Category number 1, Yesh Kiddushin ve'ein Avera. There is marriage, no Avera. Right? Status of the child is determined by, right, father. That's category 1. Right? Category 2, there is Kiddushin and there is Avera. Right? So what's the halacha? Status is determined by, we call the pagum. The pagum, right? The parent with the genealogical or status issue. Good. Category number 3. Ultimately, again, there is no kiddushin in this case, right? But she can marry someone else, right? So that's a case. Ultimately, again, for example, of like adultery or something like that. Ultimately, again, what's the halacha? Mamzeres, right? So okay, so she can have kiddushin, but not with the man who she's having a child with. Ultimately, but she can have kiddushin with others. Mamzeres in category number 4. Ultimately, again, as a woman with whom you cannot have kiddushin. I will say, what's the halacha in that case? Status of the child follows the mother. Fine. So we'll say, what do we just do in this last TALMUD? What do we just do? All we just establish is the way the Mishnah is structured is every category begins with the same words and ultimately ends with the same words. It begins with the words of kol makom. And what does kol makom come to teach me? We are espousing a principle. We're going to give examples, but the list is not all-inclusive. There are more examples of each principle than those listed in the Mishnah. And the Ezazu, when the Mishnah gives examples, what it's also coming to do is include certain things, but exclude other things. That's the entirety of what we just did in this sugya. Good, let's go right there. Says the Gemara, Gufa, Kiyas Rabbi Yochanan, Bo'umos halach achar hazachar. So Rabbi said, this is an interesting case. When it comes to the nations of the world, Rabbi say, so again, the status of the child is determined by the father. Okay, Nizgairu, however, again, if the people convert, halach achar hapagum shebishnehem. Ultimately, again, we go after the more damaged genealogical one of the two. What does this mean? What does that mean? In other words, that in the nations of the world we go after the zachar. In other words, what's the for us? Like, what's the impact of that? This is actually very interesting. Kiddushin. Minayin la'echad mina umos shaba ala knanis v'holid ben. Well, so listen to this. Let's say you have. This is talking about non-Jews, talking about non-Gentiles. So you have a guy from a faraway nation, right? Who goes ahead, let's keep it simple, a guy from Edom who has relations with a woman from Canaan, a Canaanist. And I will say, just to point out, just to understand, Canaanist, in general, whenever we speak about like a Canaani refers to anyone from the 7 indigenous nations who inhabited Canaan when we got there. The Chiti, the Yevusi, the whole list of people. We call them generically Canaani. So, right, watch this. So a Gentile man from a foreign nation, call him from Edom, has relations with a Canaanist, with a woman from Canaan, V'holid ben, they have a child, Shata Rashay Liknoso Be'eved. You are permitted to go ahead and purchase that offspring as an Eved Kinani. Eved Kinani. So we'll say, listen to this. Look at Rashi. Minayin le'echad mekol umos sheba'olim she'inon mina umos shel Eretz Yisroel shamar hakasav aleim lo sechaya kol neshama. So we'll say. So remember again. Here's what's interesting. When it comes to the 7 indigenous nations, what's halacha? You have to wipe them out, or they leave, right? But you're not allowed to leave them in Eretz Yisroel. Remember again. This was the whole issue with the concern of having avodah zarah take root in Eretz Yisroel. So now says, here's what's interesting. Look at Rashi. Shabala Knanis, Shebechlal lo Zechaya, Voadin lechaveis lechivis livusis elashkom mikron. So Shata Rashay. I'm sorry. One more Rashi. Shata Rashay liknosa be'eved dishadina lebasar zachar umutar lachiosam. Now watch this. So how do I know? So here let's go with the facts that I know. The nations indigenous to Eretz Yisroel, right? When Moshe Rabbeinu comes, when Yoshua leads the people in, remember again, the halacha is lo sechaya kol neshama. You have to wipe out the nations, or they can leave. You don't have to wipe them out, but they have to leave Eretz Yisroel. They have to leave Eretz Yisroel. So we'll say, so now watch this. How do I know that if a man from Edom has a child with a woman from Canaan, that I'm allowed to take that offspring as an eved? Now, saying that I'm allowed to take that offspring as an eved means that you're allowed to allow that offspring to live. So we'll say, which essentially means that who determines the status of the offspring? Who determines it? The father, right? Because remember, again, that means that child is considered to be an Edomite, not a Canaani. So how do I know? That Talmud Lomar, Begam Mibnei Toshavim Hagarim Imachem Mehem Tiknu. The pasuk says, from the children of the residents who live with you, ultimately, again, you are permitted to go ahead and take servants. Look at Rashi. V'gam b'mnei toshavim ule'el minei kseh ba'avdecha v'amascha shariyu l'cha me'ez hagoyim asher suosechem shem zayin umos mehem tiknu eved v'amo v'samoch lei v'gam b'mnei toshavim klor v'lo mishar umos levadam. So this is incredible. So therefore, when we say that when it comes to Gentile relationships, right? So when a Gentile woman ultimately go ahead and have a child, the identity of that child goes after the father. So we see that we're like, who cares? What does that matter to us? It does matter to us, because what it means is, if a Canaanite woman has a child with a man from another nation, from an Edomite man, that child has the status of the father, and therefore, again, I am permitted to purchase that offspring as a servant. Right? It doesn't have the status of a Canaani, rather it has the status of an Edomite. Okay? So the Gemara says, Yochol, Af Eved Shabal Shivcha Min HaUmos V'holid Ben Shatarasha Liknosa Be'eved. So what about a Canaani man who has a child with a woman from a foreign nation? Should I be permitted to purchase that offspring as an Eved? If I say purchasing that offspring as an Eved is also this, in other words, that means that there's no obligation to either to wipe them out or to push them out. Talmud Lomar, Asher Holido Ba'artzechem, Min Hanolodim Ba'artzechem, V'lo Min Hagar Ba'artzechem. No. You could purchase servants ultimately, again, from the Gentile offspring born in your land, but not from those who are indigenous to your land. So ultimately, again, so this is what it means when we say that the identity of, by Goyim, the identity by the nations of the world is determined by the father, even though 9 out of 10 times, what does it matter to us? But it does matter in this specific case when it comes to the 7 nations indigenous to Canaan, where you have to either eradicate them or push them out. So halacha l'maisa, if you have a man from another nation who has a child with a Canaanist, that child has the identity of the father. Conversely, a Canaani who has a child with a woman from another nation, that offspring has the status of a Canaani and therefore is subject to all of the halachos that we have vis-a-vis those indigenous nations. Incredible. So the Gemara goes weiter. First, a second white line, sign of base 67b. Kol she'ein lo alav kiddushin. So, did I skip? Okay, sorry. Niskayru halach achra pagum shebishneim. So remember again. Now, okay, so this is still in the status of a non-Jewish couple. So if they go ahead and they convert, ultimately status is determined by the pagum, the one who is more genealogically compromised. So what's the case? So we'll say, if you want to say it's a case of a male Mitzri, right, who marries an Ammonis, a woman from Ammon, my pagum ika, Ammoni velo Ammonis. Ella, so let's listen to this. It's actually very interesting. Ella, ba'ammoni shenasa Mitzris. So we'll say, okay, this is a very interesting case. There are certain limitations on certain nations marrying into Klal Yisrael. Right? So, for example, the halacha is Torah says, Lo yavo Ammoni bekal Hashem. A male member of the nation of Ammon is not permitted to marry into the Yisrael. Now, what does that mean? A male member of Ammon could convert. He could convert, but he is not allowed to marry into the general marriage pool. Right? That's the halacha. How long does that prohibition extend for? Forever. It never changes. Conversely, let's say, for example, a Mitzri, an Egyptian, and I will say there's a reason for each of these, right? But an Egyptian convert. Right? So an Egyptian, what's the halacha? 3 generations. right? For 3 generations, they cannot marry into the regular marriage pool. They both say, who do you marry if you can't marry into the general marriage pool? You can marry other converts, right? You could also marry mamzerim, although again, that's going to come with its own issues, genealogical issues, but you cannot marry into the general marriage pool. I both say, just so you understand, in both of these cases, it's punitive, right? By the Mitzri, it's punitive because of what the Mitzrim did to us. By Ammon and Moab, it's also punitive, right? Why? The Torah says because they did not come out to greet us with bread and water when we were traveling in the desert. Remember again, these are our cousins. Right? Ammon and Moab are our cousins from Lot, right? From Lot, the nephew of Avram Avinu. So this is our mishpacha. This is our mishpacha. And yet they did not come out to greet us with bread and water when we were traveling. So I will say, so now watch this case. Watch this case. So the Gemara says, first wide line, Ela ba'amoni shenasa mitzris. So this is fascinating. What happens if you have a male member of Ammon, who, right, both these people converted. So you have an Ammonite convert who married a mitzris, a woman who's an Egyptian convert. I will say, now watch this. So what's that? So now what did the Mishnah say? What did the Mishnah say? Or the Brisa said? If you have 2 non-Jews who converted, the status of their offspring is determined by who? The pogum. Right? The more damaged genealogical one determines the offspring of the status of the offspring. So watch this. So now if you have a male member, an Ammonite, a male member of Ammon who married a mitzris. So they have a child. So what's the status of the child? It depends. If they have a boy, so Shaja Basrei Didei. If they have a boy, the boy will take on the status of his father as an Ammonite ger. As an Ammonite ger, and therefore again will also be restricted in the marriage pool. Vim nekeva, but if it's a girl, shaja abasra dida. Now both say if it's a girl, so remember both say the prohibition on Ammon to convert in and marry into the Jewish people is only on who? The men. It's not on the women, right? The haraya rus, right? It's not on the women. So therefore, if it's a boy, we'll ascribe to the boy the status of the father. If it's a girl, we'll ascribe to her the status of the mother. Now that makes her a Mitzri Sheni, which ultimately means that her offspring, the Mitzri Shlishi, could marry into the general pool. Okay, fascinating. Second one line of both sides. Kol she'in alav Kiddushin. So I'll say, so remember again, the Mishnah said, anyone, remember again, this was, kol she'in, I'm sorry. Yeah, kol she'in la alav Kiddushin. So I will say, so this is actually category number 3. This is category number 3 of where a man has a child with a woman whom he cannot marry, but she can marry other people. So the typical case of this would be adultery, right? Adultery. So I'll say, so remember again, this is pretty, so remember what does this union produce? A mamzer. A mamzer. So any case, this is any case of arayos. Any case of arayos. So any case of arayos, the man cannot affect Kiddushin with this woman. It is impossible to affect. But this same woman could affect Kiddushin with other men. So what's the status of their offspring? Status of their offspring is going to be a mamzer. From where do we know this? From where do I know? From where do I know that halacha l'maisa, if a man has relations with a woman with whom he cannot have Kiddushin, but she could have Kiddushin with other people, that the offspring of that union is a mamzer. So the Gemara says, "Don't Rabbi Bar Abba, Rabbi Yochanan, Umatu ba Mishum Rabbi Yana, Rav Acha B'Rei Rabba, Umatu ba Mishum Rabbi Yosef Levi." Amar Kra, the pasuk says, "This is interesting. V'yatsa mi Beisol, v'halcha v'haitza li'ish acher." So it's actually it's interesting. This pasuk is by divorce, right? Then what happens if a man divorces his woman? Ultimately, again, he will leave her home, and she will be a wife to someone else. V'haitza li'ish acher, someone else. Lachirim below the krovim. Ultimately, again, to others, but not to relatives. Take a look at Rashi. I will say Rashi is in the wide lines, about 2, 4, 6, 7 lines into the wide lines. Li'ish acher, shehu acher etzla, v'lo shu krova, v'haisa lashon kiddushinhu, shahaisa lo bahen li'isha. So I will say, what you see here is as follows. When the Torah describes, now it's interesting, what we're doing is we're extrapolating the laws of marriage from within the context of divorce. So the Torah says that when a man gives his wife a get, ultimately again she will become a wife to who? Who could she marry? Who could she marry? Acher. Now, acher means what? We interpret that means acher and not relatives. So from here you see, it'll say that the institution of marriage only works vis-a-vis, quote unquote, other men and not to relatives. So from here we see that a woman cannot marry a relative. And I will say, so therefore again, what we're going to extrapolate this, we're going to expound this a little bit more. Maskil Rabbi Abba, ve'ima la'achar v'lo leben. So I will say, maybe ultimately again, it refers ultimately she can marry someone else and not the son of the man who she divorced. So the Gemara says, Ben behedjiksiv. It says explicitly, lo yikach ish es eshes aviv. So I will say, the Torah explicitly says that a man cannot marry the wife of his father. We're talking about over here, even the wife of his father is not what? Not his mother. Right? So in other words, you can't marry your stepmother. To which the Gemara says, if that's the case, acher la'amali, why do I need the word acher? What does that come to teach me? To which the Gemara says, shma, ultimately again, le'acherim, v'lo l'krovim. So I will say, acher comes to teach me dafka acher and not to krovim. It's dafka coming to teach me a specific halacha, which is, by sali ish acher, a woman could marry an acher, someone else, bless you, but there is no kiddushin when it comes to one's relatives. So I will say, very interesting. Ve'ema, idi v'idi leben, maybe both the word acher, and ultimately again the pasuk lo yikach ishes aviv are both coming to teach in the same halacha, namely that a son cannot marry his father's wife. So I didn't two psukim. Halachatchila v'hadiavad. Both say teaches me. In other words, both say sometimes a marriage could be prohibited, but if you did it, b'diavad it works. Maybe he's come to teach me that if a son tries to marry his father's wife, l'chatchila he can't do it, and even if you try to do it b'diavad, it still doesn't work. L'chatchila me'achos isha nafka. No. We'll say the fact that you can't marry an erva, ultimately again, l'chatchila, that I know already from achos isha, from marrying the wife's sister. Uma achos isha bekares lo tikdash. So we'll say, so ultimately again, so when it comes to achos isha, remember, if a man tries to marry his wife's sister, that is punishable by kares. Punishable by kares. Uma achos isha bekares lo tikdash. So I'll say, if at the end of the day, marrying your wife's sister, which is punishable by kares, if you try to affect Kiddushin, it doesn't work. The Rabbi says it's actually interesting. In our minds, we often think that a chi of kares is more chamer than misas bezdin. But it's not true. Actually, misas bezdin, something punishable by a bezdin, is always more chamer than kares. Kares, remember again, is at the hands of heaven. So also because it's at the hands of heaven, technically speaking, what does that tell me? It's forgivable. Technically, it's a forgivable transgression. In a human court, once there's liability, it's not forgivable anymore. So if by achos isha, which is punishable by kares, if you try to affect the marriage, it doesn't work. So we'll say, so all the more so when it comes to something punishable in misos bezin, which would be a case, for example, of a son trying to marry his father's wife. Certainly wouldn't work. Maybe both of these psukim, maybe the pasuk by achos isha and acher, are both coming to teach that you can't marry your wife's sister. Halachatchila hadyevet, and one is talking about lachatchila you can't do it, and even b'diyevet if you tried it still wouldn't work. So the Gemara says inachinami, fine. Ashkechan achos isha. So we'll say, so now essentially what I have is based on the pasuk and acher. I learned that what if you try to marry your wife's sister, Abosai, it doesn't work. The Kiddushin doesn't work. From where do I know? Shar arayos minalan. How do I know that in any case of erva, right? In any relationship that falls under the umbrella of arayos, if you try to affect Kiddushin with this woman, it doesn't work. You cannot affect Kiddushin. So how do I know that is true? So the Gemara says, Yafina me achos isha. Maybe I can learn that from achos isha. Ma achos isha miyuchedes shi erva v'chayav and azadona karis v'ashir gasechatos. When it comes to achos isha, which is an erva, and ultimately, again, if you do it intentionally, you're chayav karis, and unintentionally, if you unintentionally, accidentally have relations with your wife's sister. I mean, good luck explaining that one, right? But lamaisa, right? But lamaisa, right? If it was ultimately, again, it was a shogeg. There's a chatos. V'lo tafsi ba kiddushin. Ultimately, again, kiddushin doesn't take effect. So we'll say maybe this is the paradigm. It's paradigm. Af kol shihi erva v'chayaven al zadona karis al shigas achatos lo tafsi ba kiddushin. Ultimately, we'll say so halakha l'maisa. Say any case that's an erva, and where you're chayav karis for intentional violation, chatas for unintentional violation. Ultimately, again, kiddushin doesn't work. To which the Gemara says, I would say, we'll have to stop over here. We'll have to stop over here. I would say, so bottom line, so someone say, we're stopping in the middle of. What we're trying to figure out is a very simple thing, yet incredibly profound. The Mishnah told me that halacha l'maisa, any case where you can't affect Kiddushin, any case where you can't, but this woman could have Kiddushin with other people, what's the halacha? The offspring is a mamzer. Which tells me, now what the Mishnah is also teaching me, kind of just derech agav, is you can't affect Kiddushin with a woman who is an erva to you. Now the only thing I'm trying to figure out is, how do I know that? How do I know that? So the Gemara wanted to suggest that maybe the paradigm is Eshes Ishto, is your wife's sister. Maybe that's the paradigm. Again, we're kind of leaving off in the middle of that paradigm. We'll continue with this tomorrow. We'll say, find resolution as well. We'll say, Shkoyach.